Hello everyone and welcome back to my bookish channel. Um, I got a request from a nice viewer called Mike to talk about my own books because I'd mentioned them a few times and because lots of people on here are completely new to obviously to what I do. I thought maybe he was right and I should talk a bit about the things I've done over the years. This year, uh, 2024, I had to remind myself what year it was, is now 30 years I've had as a published writer and novelist. It was 1994 when I sold my first short story to an anthology called New Writing, which the British Council published with Vintage. And there was an open call for stories. Now, I was doing my MA in creative writing. I think I just finished it at Lancaster, and I'd moved on to my PhD on Angela Carter. Anyway, this book, New Writing 4, was what my first story, Patient Iris, came out in. It didn't come out till 95, but it was 94 when I got the letter. And it's got this list of writers on the back, and I'm in the middle of it. It begins with Brian Aldiss and finishes with Faye Weldon and Susan Wicks. And there's all sorts of people involved, amazing people in this book. And I was very happy to have this story out. And it led to my first novel. What I thought I'd do is talk through some books. I'll not go into any great depth. I'll just give you a kind of sketch of some of the things I've been up to. I'll leave out, I think, Doctor Who books for this because I'll do Doctor Who videos at some point. The first book I had out was 95. It was the first book entirely in my own name, marked for life. Now, Chatto and Windus were the hardback imprint, really classy, wonderful literary publisher. And they'd published Angela Carter and Iris Murdoch and Edmund White and Alan Hollinghurst. And they'd published New Writing 4. They were involved in that. And they bought my first novel almost immediately. I'd had the manuscript with them for quite a while, I think. It was waiting on their piles of stuff, and they realized when this story came out. So it was all synchronous. Anyway, I was 25. It was my first novel. It was magical realism on a council estate in the north and very queer with a big Q, as we used to say in the 90s. It's about a tattooed man with a checkered past whose child goes missing, and it's a kind of a hunt for this girl who's been kidnapped by an invisible man, essentially. It led to a trilogy, all set on the same council estate, Phoenix Court, it was called. Does It Show was the sequel that came out the next year, um, about Liz, a transsexual character who moves onto the estate, and all the women around her living nearby realize that they knew her when she was her previous self. Um, it was actually the first book I wrote in this trilogy. I wrote that one for my MA in about 91, 92, and caused a huge kerfuffle with my extravagant magical realism and my sex scenes on the MA course. And there was the end of the trilogy, Could It Be Magic, which I wrote also for Chatto in about 97, 98. It came out in 98. Begins with a party thrown in a house in the middle of the estate for all the characters for the first two books. And it's about a bodybuilding man who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a hybrid creature from his calf muscle, a leopard, in fact. So more magical realism, and that was my trilogy. At the same time, they published a collection of stories playing out. By then, I'd moved to Edinburgh, and this was 1996. And these are very kind of strange, phantasmagorical short stories. It begins with Patient Iris, the first story I had out. So that was my first kind of batch of things in the late 90s. Missing after that is Fancy Man, novel which moves from the north of England to Edinburgh and through the whole of the 1990s. It was bought by, it's a very strange story, about 1999, um, by a very fancy publisher. I was dumped by Chatto after 4 books, not making any money from you. You're dumped. My editor had left. I was left in this wilderness the first time I realized, and not for the last. I was dumped without a publisher, and that's what happens in this kind of slightly brutal age of publishing, which the 90s saw in the collapse of the net book agreement, which meant that books could be discounted. So popular books became even more popular. And the mid list, as they used to call it, of books that just sold okay as names grew, as reputations were made, were dropped. So I was cold. And I moved to this fancy publisher at the behest of an editor who then decided he despised what I was writing, having praised me extravagantly to get there. Anyway, Fancy Man crashed and burned. It was a retelling of Henry James's Portrait of a Lady. It took many years to come out again, and in fact, the manuscript was lost in our cellar for many years. Anyway, it's come out again in more recent years, and very odd to look back on. It's nice to have a missing book. Now, after that, I moved to Allison and Busby, which were tiny, tiny, tiny. But the new editor there was David Shelley, who came to talk to my students at UEA, and we got on really well. And now he rules the whole universe, it turns out. He's gone on to amazing things in publishing, and he runs just about everything. Anyway, back then, 25 years ago, I sent him the novel that I was writing in the wake of the cancellation of Fancy Man. And I suddenly went very hard-edged and crime-based. I took to a life of crime, or rather, I was reading books about serial killers and about people who spend their lives in jail. And I ended up writing Modern Love, a novel about twin girls who I realise now that I've written 2 novels about twins over the years. But in this, they kill a boy at school, or one of them is responsible for the killing of a boy at school when they're quite young, and the other twin, the innocent one, takes the blame and gets put away for years and years, and eventually seeks revenge on everybody. It's a very dark, very, very dark book. So that was the turn of the millennium when I was writing the darkest, maybe the darkest I ever have, really. Followed up by All the Rage. Now, this is when maybe I started losing my reputation for writing literary fiction, because I chose to write about a pop band that had won the Eurovision Song Contest years ago, and 20 years on, they try to reunite for a tour, and they end up in a ridiculous road trip across the country, meeting lookalikes and drag queens and all sorts of people. It's a proper romp, again with lots of darkness in it, but because it was about pop culture, I think people in that kind of very literary world looked down on it, maybe, as much as they looked at it at all. I do remember that I went from having reviews in the Sunday Times and the Guardian and the TLS, half-page things. Suddenly with this one, it was paperback roundup. Although, I do remember getting some lovely reviews at that time, but they definitely shrank to paperback roundup. This was in the times when you still had decent amounts of reviews in newspapers anyway. You don't have that at all now. And those things don't seem to have the same weight, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, followed up by Isles in 2002, which is a kind of a novel set in Norfolk. It's a novel about writers. Iris Murdoch working in a supermarket, and the lives of a whole number of characters that intersect. It's my version of Virginia Woolf's The Waves, believe it or not, but set in a supermarket where all the characters are going up and down the aisles. Um, I think it was almost completely ignored, possibly. Followed up by my trashiest to date at that point, To the Devil a Diva. Now, I'd been reading lots of 20th century ghost stories and horror fiction, and I loved the tackiest ones, the ones like Dennis Wheatley about black magic cults and people calling up the devil. So at that point, Jeremy had moved to Manchester, and I knew a bit about Canal Street and the Village and the world of Granada Studios and TV soap opera. So I managed to make all of that collide. The kind of Satan worshipping, To the Devil a Diva, The Devil Rides Out kind of Dennis Wheatley stuff with um, Queer as Folk and Coronation Street, really. And wrote a ludicrous novel. Not that ludicrous, I don't know. It was the beginning of lots of things that later became other things. So Effie from Brenda and Effie first appears in here in a slightly altered form. Carla Sorensen, the film star, the lesbian vampire film star who appears in later books, also crops up there. I'm beginning to mess around with the idea of uh, transmigration of characters across different novels and different genres. By then, of course, I was also doing my kids' books and Doctor Who books, so I was carrying on writing careers in different directions, um, which is fun, if confusing and dizzying. Yes, as I said, my um, writing for children had begun by then. I'd always wanted to write for kids, and in 2002, I published the semi-autobiographical Strange Boy with Simon and Schuster, and it had a gay central character, which caused no end of fuss in the media. And I had to go on things like BBC Breakfast Time and all the radio shows, and I was up and down to London, and lots of newspaper stuff, because people couldn't believe that you would do a book for kids with a gay character in the middle, a gay 10-year-old in the middle of it all. And there was a lot of nonsense about that. Even a character questioning the omnipresence of have you got a girlfriend? The assumptions that people make about kids growing up, and a kid realizing at the age of 10, as I did, as people do, that they don't fit in. To even write about that was seen as shocking in 2002. And it was still the time. It was right before Clause 28 disappeared off the statute books, in which teachers couldn't even discuss homosexuality in schools because, as Thatcher had thought back in the 80s, it was teaching children wrong. Just evil legislation. And it's very recent. And, now in our world of rainbow, this, that, and the other, and everything being marvelous, which it's not, people forget that it was that recent. And, with lots and lots of LGBTQ plus books for kids and teens, I do feel that has suddenly all appeared, and I don't know, people don't remember Strange Boy. I kind of resent the shit that I went through in trying to bring it out. Anyway, it's disappeared now. I should think about republishing it, but it kind of does hurt a bit, really. Anyway, I followed it up at the time with Hands Up, a very silly, very kind of savage satire about showbiz again. It's about a TV puppeteer who tries to make a comeback, or rather sets his son off to make a comeback, and the ragged old puppet that he used on TV, Tolstoy, the long-eared bat, turns out to be possessed and a serial killer. And this puppet leads our young hero on a career of murdering other TV puppets. It was followed up by Exchange, which was kind of more serious again. And this is what Simon and Schuster and the people there didn't really appreciate, that with each kid's book, they weren't the same as each other. I wasn't writing endless clones of the last book, which is what children's publishing has turned into. I wrote what interested me, and this was a fairly sad book about an orphaned boy who lives with his grandparents, who's obsessed with paperback books. And um, and actually it's about a little free library in the end. And it is quite melancholic and it is quite serious. And I did find myself at the time, because it was nominated for a nice prize, I ended up doing events, a few nice prizes, but I did events with people who were very noisy and brash. And hey, kids, like everybody became stand-up comedians at these events, and I'd have to get up and here's my slightly melancholic, slightly um, sad book for kids. In amidst all, of people turning cartwheels, really, which was quite difficult and quite funny. Twin Freaks followed. There was a book that crashed and burned for Simon and Schuster. I wrote a fantasy. It was meant to be a fantasy trilogy, and they canned it, which I still feel sore about. It's a long story in itself. What happens is when you have an editor who leaves, who you've been getting on and doing these books together, your editor leaves and a new one comes in. It's quite tricky sometimes to negotiate the changeover. They want to bring in their own people, of course, their own choices of books, and they don't always like what they're left with from the previous incumbent. Twin Freaks was a novel about twins again. Um, twins going in for a show like a TV talent show. One can sing and one can't, and they're Siamese twins. It's really sick. I don't think they do it now. And then the last one for Simon and Schuster was The Diary of a Doctor Who Addict, which was a kind of follow-up to Strange Boy and about the beginnings of my obsession with Doctor Who in 2012. A book beset by problems not of my making, and one of the most peculiar and stressful times of my life, to do with I can't even go into it. Somebody who felt they were being fictionalized in the book, a relative, and it was disastrous. The ninnies followed. So Simon Schuster dumped me. This is a story of being dumped. And Obverse Books, my friend Stuart in Edinburgh, runs Obverse Books, which is a small press dedicated to science fiction and all the things that Stuart loves and is interested in, as a small press should be. And he published The Ninnies, which was my next children's book, about spooky, sepulchral beings who live in Manchester, who giggle just before they jump out of the dark and get you. And they live in a factory that makes crisps, and all night they giggle as they put bogies into packets of crisps. And they do much worse things. They steal bits of animals from the zoo. They saw legs off giraffes and things. Then in the mid 2010s or whatever, the teens, I wrote a trilogy for Firefly, a new press then, 10 years old now, in Wales, about Mars. Lost on Mars, The Martian Girl, and The Heart of Mars. And they came out over 3 or 4 years. It was a kind of, I wanted to write something that was kind of golden age type science fiction with kind of Ray Bradbury, Martian Chronicles, that kind of feel, 1950s, 60s science fiction, and combine it with Laura Ingalls Wilder and Little House on the Prairie. So it's about pioneers on Mars scratching out a living from the red dirt, and then going to the city, which is a green city under a bubble. So that really, it was writing the kind of science fiction I really wanted to read, and I loved doing this. I don't think it did much for them. My then agent no longer, told me that Firefly were a bit embarrassed about it all, which seems a shame. That was the last I heard from them. I hope they won't. I hope they're as proud as I am of the books, but you never know. I better pause there. I'm on 20 minutes and I still have a pile of things here. I will continue this ramshackle anecdote in the next episode. Okay, I'm going to press the button and say, see you again soon. Goodbye.